This summer, Instacart is bringing back your favorites from 1999 with prices from 1999. That means 90s prices on juice pouches that ought to be respected, 90s prices on box mac and cheese, and 90s prices on ham, cheese, and cracker lunches. Enjoy all those throwbacks and more at throwback prices, only through Instacart. $4.72 maximum discount per $10 of eligible items. Limit one offer per order. Expires September 5th while supplies last. Discount based on CPI comparison.
Welcome again to the Explaining History podcast, and I'm very, very pleased to be joined today by writer Mark Bridgeman, who's here to tell us about the extraordinary story of an Edwardian fraudster, Violet Charlesworth, in his new account of her life, works, and crimes, Nothing for Something. So firstly, welcome, Mark. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Welcome. Thanks for letting me come on to talk about the amazing Violet.
Fabulous. And it sounds already, I was reading part of it, and it sounds like that there is a kind of like a sort of like a complicated relationship that you have with her, as often happens when you're researching complex characters.
So Violet is one of those women that is very difficult not to admire, I think, despite the fact that she was basically a fraudster.
Yeah.
And conned everybody from rich, wealthy businessmen to an old widow. But she just seems to be someone that you can't help admire. And I think it's because she had style.
Okay.
And yeah, it's something that's probably gone from the modern era. This kind of Edwardian style that she had and the way that she carried on and what happened to her in the end, which we'll get to eventually, are just things that really just, you look at her and you think, what an amazing woman. How did she get away with it?
So let's start with her then. Let's begin there. So who was Violet Charlesworth?
Right. So Violet Charlesworth, we'll start right at the beginning, was not her real name. Her real name was May Charlesworth. Now, she was born to working class parents in the Midlands in England. And she was brought up in Stafford and Derby, Wolverhampton for a little while. Her father was an engineer, and they lived in, terraced houses in working class streets. But Violet's mother particularly had social pretensions.
Right.
And she brought Violet up the same way to have these pretensions and used to introduce Violet at social occasions and things. And the story developed from there, which I'll get onto in a minute. So Violet at some point decided she didn't like the name May Charlesworth. So she changed her name, or she told everybody her name was Violet May Gordon Charlesworth. Now, the Gordon was meant to hint at some Scottish ancestry, which, as far as I'm aware, they didn't have at all.
Mm-hmm.
Now, she was trying to claim that she was the goddaughter of General Gordon of Khartoum, the hero of the army, you see. Which she wasn't at all. But she was hoping that this name Gordon would give her some sort of cachet, this imagined Scottish heritage, which she seemed to be absolutely fascinated with throughout her life, although there's absolutely no proof or anything that I've ever been able to trace to show that there was anything Scottish about her at all. Anyway, so moving on from that, she adopted the name Violet. Her mother took her to a draper's shop in Derby. I think Violet was about 14, 15 or 16 then. Took her to a draper's shop and tried to order Violet some expensive clothes, which they didn't have the money for. But Violet's mum, who was called Miriam, managed to persuade the draper to pass this lovely set of clothes on to Violet on the understanding that Violet was due to inherit some money when she was 21 and that they would pay her back with interest, you see. And wouldn't it be great for a lovely girl like Violet to be seen modelling these clothes round and about Derby? It would be great for everybody. Everybody would be a winner. So this happened. Violet was given these clothes, and her mum and Violet suddenly realised, wow, that was easy. We can try that again. And then they tried it a couple more times in shops, saying that Violet was due to inherit some money when she was 21. And it worked again and again, and Violet was given some clothes, and then they moved on to jewellery and furs and hats and things like that.
Right.
So steadily accumulating lots of nice possessions with this vague promise that they would pay them back, pay the suppliers back when Violet was 21. Now, she invented, between her and her mother, they invented 2 inheritance stories, which are really the beginnings of the inheritance scam, which is something that's quite prevalent today. So we had Anna Delvey in New York in the last few years, which was a big Netflix series recently called Inventing Anna, who really copied Violet's scam completely. This claim that you're about to inherit some money from a wealthy relative,
right,
and you'll pay it back with interest. And it's similar to these Nigerian prince scams that used to go around, all this sort of thing. It all starts with Violet and this incredible inheritance story she told. Now, Violet spun 2 stories. One was that she was the goddaughter of General Gordon, the famed British general. Now, he had already died by this point, so it was very difficult for anybody to disprove what Violet was saying. You see, this wasn't an era where it was very easy to check things. You kind of had to take people's word for it. And that's what we did with Violet. So she span this story, and it worked. It worked pretty well with most people. She claimed that she was due to inherit £75,000, which was a lot of money then, and it worked with some people, not with everybody, but with some people. Bizarrely, the story seemed to work better with men than women. So Violet and her mum were able to twist men around their fingers a little bit better than women, although they did succeed with some women. Violet also had another story, was that she had become engaged to be married to a young, handsome British soldier who'd gone away to fight, a guy called Alexander MacDonald, and then he'd been lost at sea on a voyage back to the UK, and she was looking to borrow some money so that she could go and lay a wreath of flowers in the Bay of Biscay, where this imaginary soldier's boat had sunk, you see. So she used that story with some people, and with other people she used the General Gordon story, and she was generally quite successful. Then around 1906, 1907, the family suddenly moved up sticks and moved to North Wales and leased a large house called Bodowy, which is now a restaurant in North Wales. They leased a large house, and it was very difficult to explain to people where this money suddenly came from. Now, they told people that Violet's father had changed jobs and he'd began to work for an insurance company, but this was clearly not true. The money was clearly coming from Violet. So she'd upped her game so much that she was now renting a large country house. She also acquired a car for herself, which at the time was obviously a very expensive item. She then acquired a maid, a gardener, a cook. But this wasn't enough for Violet.
No.
So she then decided, I need another country estate. So she leased a large country house in Wiltshire, in Calne in Wiltshire. She leased herself a large country house there. She decided to acquire 12 pedigree dogs. And had kennels built at the house. Acquired another car and another chauffeur.
Good grief.
Yet more clothes, yet more jewellery. She trips to London, shopping trips, furnishing the house. She became engaged to a doctor in North Wales called Dr. Edward Hughes Jones. Now, he was about 21 years older than Violet, and he fell hopelessly in love with Violet. They became engaged. He lent Violet today's equivalent of £500,000, £500,000. So he must have been a fairly wealthy guy, really on the promise that they were about to be married. And she also returned to the Midlands and managed to take £400 from a old widow called Martha Smith.
And is she at this point kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul? It's sort of like kind of, a scam reaches a certain point where you have to keep finding dupes in order to kind of pay for stuff that you've now had on tick.
Yeah, well, it sort of there were two reasons for it, really. So I think her appetite was insatiable, and she just kept needing more and more things to satisfy herself.
Yeah.
But what really happened was that there was a bit of a time bomb ticking, and that was the fact that she told everyone that when she reached the age of 21, she would be able to receive this massive inheritance and pay everybody back with interest. As her 21st birthday approached, Violet suddenly told everybody that, in fact, the trustees of this vast estate had told her that it had been changed, and there were complications, and she would now have to wait till she was 25 to receive the money. So that gave her another 4 years.
Right.
She then decided, I need a quick way to make some money to pay back all of the money that I borrowed. So she persuaded a very large firm of London stockbrokers called Fenton Dale and Company to lend her £10,000. That's £10,000 then, which is today's equivalent of knocking on for £1 million, to invest in stocks and shares. And she had decided that with the interest and the dividends that she earned, she would be able to pay people back and still maintain a decent lifestyle for herself.
Yeah.
Now, this started okay for Violet. She invested in American railroad stock, which was booming at the time. Things were going well for a few months. Then suddenly there was a big stock market crash in the States.
Yeah.
And that was the end of that. She suddenly lost a huge amount of money. So instead of earning more money, she suddenly had another debt to the stockbrokers of another £10,000. But that didn't stop Violet. She just kept asking people for money, kept pulling the same scam, the same fraud everywhere that she went. She leased another country house, which was called Flowerburn House up near Inverness, a big Scottish shooting estate that she wanted to have to host big shooting parties in the season. Now, so Violet at one point had 6 motor cars. And bearing in mind, in 1909 in Britain, there were only 3,000 motor cars on the road. So Violet actually had 6 of them herself, and a chauffeur, of course. Now, eventually, obviously, things started to unravel. And this is the great part of the story, which really lifts it above most of these other sort of grubby fraud stories that you hear, is Violet decided to stage her own death in a car crash in North Wales. In January 1909, just after the New Year. Now, she left with her sister and her chauffeur, apparently to go for afternoon tea at the Castle Hotel in Bangor. And on the way back, the car hit a wall on a dangerous bend on a cliff road, which is now the A55. It's now a big dual carriageway. But at the time, it was just a lonely country road near a village called Penmaenmawr. And there's this dangerous bend in the road. The car hit the bend. Violet was apparently thrown over the top of the windscreen. It was an open top car, over the top of the windscreen, down the rocks into the sea below. Her sister and chauffeur ran to the nearest house, shouting and screaming, "Help, my sister's been thrown over the cliff into the sea." A huge search was organised. The police were called. Fishermen and locals with boats went out looking for Violet, and they couldn't find her. And the story was that Violet had washed away to sea. And this story held for a day or two until people started to become suspicious.
Yeah.
Locals who had great knowledge of the area knew that it was very uncommon for this to happen. The body would have had to have been thrown quite a long way horizontally away from the car in order to actually land in the sea and not just land on the rocks underneath. Violet's hat and a map were found on the rocks underneath, but they were dry. indicating that the water had never risen to that level. So surely if they'd landed, Violet's body would have landed as well. There was no blood in the car. The car wasn't really damaged. There were all sorts of questions to be asked.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, Violet had disappeared on the run. And this is a really sort of fascinating and intriguing part of the story.
Yeah.
So I've managed to uncover through witness statements from Irish newspapers that it appears that Violet actually initially took a late night mail train and boarded the mail boat from Holyhead across to Ireland, to Dublin, and then took a train down in the morning along the coast of Ireland, hoping to get to Cork, hoping to catch a ship to the United States. So I'm thinking Violet was probably planning to escape to America with whatever money she had.
Yeah.
Perhaps until the heat died down.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, she wasn't able to make that boat, so she had to return back across the water to Wales and then find a second plan. So she took a series of train journeys and ended up in Oban via Glasgow up in the west of Scotland.
Okay.
From there, she took a boat across to the Isle of Mull and intended to hide out in a small hotel in Tobermory on the Isle of Mull until an eagle-eyed baker on the Isle of Mull spotted Violet, and he recognised her because she'd actually been there on holiday the year before.
Right.
And,
is this now a kind of like a sensational national story?
Yeah. So just to put this in context, so when Violet disappeared, the hunt for Violet became a national pastime, and it's actually quite hard to imagine now just how sensational this story was. So in 1909 and again into 1910, as we go further into the story, Violet actually garnered more column inches in the English language newspapers than the King and the Prime Minister put together. That's how crazily people were invested in this story of Violet. She had just completely disappeared, and the public were just fascinated with the story. Now, Violet wore a very distinctive red motor cloak, which was a long, very luxurious coat that Edwardian ladies used to use when driving all passengers in cars. It was a very fashionable thing. And Violet had one of these, and it was very, very distinctive. Now, what happened was the public, so fascinated as they were with the story, began looking out for any woman wearing a red motor cloak, you see. And suddenly women were being harassed and hassled everywhere in the streets. As soon as anybody saw a woman with a red coat on, they assumed it was Violet and grabbed them and tried to drag them to the police station and accuse them of being violent. So almost overnight, these red motor cloaks, which was the most fashionable colour and the most fashionable item of 1909, suddenly disappeared from the shops because nobody wanted to be seen in one because they were being accused of being Violet. So she had crazy little effects on social history at the time, which have long been forgotten now. Anyway, to cut a long story short, she got found in Tobermory. Eventually, she returned to Oban, and she took a room in a hotel in Oban under a false identity, Margaret MacLeod. And Violet stayed there and pretended to be Margaret MacLeod, even when the press found her. The press then arranged for Violet's sister and a neighbour to come up to Oban to identify her.
At GDIT, we design and deliver the mission technology and systems that underpin our nation's security, infrastructure, and citizen services. From the edge of the battlefield to the front lines of fraud prevention, we deliver the advanced AI, cyber, and software development that moves the mission forward. With 30,000 strong, expertise across every U.S. state, and the technology that's got your back. Learn how GDIT delivers technology for America's critical advantage at gdit.com.
And she still insisted she was Margaret MacLeod. When Violet's sister arrived in Oban, they had a ridiculous standoff where they all pretended not to know each other and denied that she was Violet Charlesworth until eventually, of course, she had to admit it.
Yeah.
And so what happened then was Violet was taken down to London to a solicitor. She made a statement, and she then faced bankruptcy. proceedings for all this money that she borrowed from people, on the understanding that she would pay it back. So she faced bankruptcy proceedings. Now, what was so clever about Violet was at no point at this time had anybody even considered that it was a fraud. She was so convincing that most people just assumed that she'd overspent money, but she was actually going to receive her inheritance. And she managed to keep this going for almost another year, until finally people realized that the story she was telling wasn't true, and it was in fact a fraud. And she had promised her creditors that she would try and earn some money and pay back all of this money that she borrowed. So I'll give you an idea. So Violet, certainly at her bankruptcy hearing anyway, she owed approximately £27,000 in 1909 to people, and those are just the people that we know about, and there will be probably double that, and that's equivalent of just over £4 million today. So that's how much money she borrowed. Now there's also lots of other bits and pieces, and people who never came forward as well. So the real figure is probably a lot higher than that, but that's what was declared at her bankruptcy hearings. So Violet decided that she would earn some money and she would try and pay her creditors back, or at least this is what she said at her bankruptcy hearing. So she then took a role on the music hall stage in the West End in London, in which she played herself in a kind of melodramatic Edwardian musical production, all about the car crash and the stage death and everything else. And she was hoping to earn lots of money from this and pay back her creditors. But unfortunately for Violet, she was booed off stage. She was terrible on stage. She froze. She didn't know what to do, and the audiences were merciless towards her. And the production only lasted a week. So that was the end of that. She was then offered the chance to play herself in a silent movie version of the event. So one of the very early silent movies, a single reeler, was filmed at the actual locations in Wales with Violet playing herself. And the money from this was also supposed to go towards her creditors. But in fact, what happened was Violet claimed such large living expenses, there wasn't actually much left for the creditors at all. So the creditors only ever really got crumbs back from Violet. Now, unfortunately, I've tried everything that I could to find this old silent movie. Wouldn't that be great? To see that, but it doesn't exist anymore. Like most silent movies, they've long deteriorated and disappeared. But anyway, that's gone. So eventually, people started to ask questions. The fraud came out, and there was a trial. Violet and her mother were found guilty of fraud. The two main accusers in the trial were the doctor and the widow, and their cases were put before the court. Violet and her mother were found guilty. Violet and her mum were sentenced to 5 years in prison. Now, the judge, in a very strange turn of events, the following day changed his mind about the sentence and reduced it to 3 years, not 5. It seems that Violet and her mother had managed to have a calming effect on him in court. So this was Justice Darling, and he had quite a reputation for harsh sentences. And anyway, for some reason, he changed his mind and reduced their sentence to 3 years. And so they were sentenced to 3 years in prison. They were both put in Aylesbury women's prisons. This is now 1910 they went to prison. Now, they were in prison at the time that the suffragettes had just started to be imprisoned by the British government in Aylesbury. So Violet and her mum were alongside some of the suffragettes in prison, and that's a particularly dark part of my book, I think. Where Violet and her mum can hear the torture that was being inflicted on the suffragettes, the force feeding and things like that was inflicted on the suffragettes. And it really, I put it in the book because it's a really interesting contrast between the pampered way that Violet and her mother had behaved, the selfish way that they'd indulged themselves and never done a day's work in their lives. And suddenly they're side by side with these women suffragettes who had sort of endured unbelievable hardships and sacrifices for their cause. So that's kind of quite an interesting part of the book. So it delves into a dark area there. And eventually, Violet and her mum were released in 1912 after a couple of years in prison, largely because Violet's sister had written to Winston Churchill, who was then Home Secretary, appealing for her mother and sister's early release because they claimed that they were ill. Now, there's a bit of a common theme in the book that Violet and her mum were often ill at any times in their life that it suited them to receive any sympathy. They were often ill. And then they were released in 1912, and Violet had a little bit of fortune then. It wasn't good fortune for those involved, but it was fortunate for Violet, was that the Titanic sunk a few weeks after Violet was released. And that had the effect of wiping every other news story from nearly every page of all the British newspapers for the best part of a year, whilst the investigation and the trials and everything else went on following the Titanic disaster. And Violet was instantly forgotten, at least for a while.
When we started writing our thoughts down on paper, it opened up endless possibilities. Ideas could grow beyond the borders of the mind, and it changed the world. Somewhere along the way, we lost touch with paper, distracted by devices made for every purpose except for thinking and focus. On edge, waiting for the next notification. But what if new technology didn't pull us away from paper, but brought us closer to it? Listen. That's not paper. It's the sound of the new Remarkable Paper Pro, rewriting the future. A paper tablet with a true color ink display, gentle reading light, and unheard of tactility. With digital features for taking notes, thinking, and organizing, without any distractions. Paper is about to change the world again. Get your paper tablet at remarkable.com today.
It's the dream of every fraudster, I suppose, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. And then, obviously the Great War came along. And by the time the Great War had finished, Violet had been forgotten. So she was the most famous woman in the English-speaking world in 1909 and 1910. And within a few years, she'd been completely forgotten. And the story itself is not that well known outside of the area in North Wales where she staged a car crash. That part of the world, there are still lots of people around who know the story, but outside of that, it's not really very well known.
Yeah. And Mark, how did you come across Violet? Where did your connection to her begin?
Well, I'd written a book about 4 years ago about a similar style of book, a similar kind of character. I wrote a book about a guy who was a war hero and a con artist from Aberdeen, and he ended up traveling the world and pulling cons and escaping the police, and he ended up in prison in France and things like that. I wrote a book about this guy, and I thought it would be really nice to have a story about a woman con artist if I could find one.
Yeah.
And I managed to find the story about Violet. When I was in North Wales, I found some details about the story. And from there, I just tried to piece it together. Now, the story's not really been written about hugely, and that's mostly because no one's been able to find out the end to Violet's story, you see. But I approached it in a different way.
Yeah.
If you like to think that Violet really pulled two con tricks in her life, which was her long-running fraud, then followed by her staged car crash. Now, both of those frauds were kind of flawed, because obviously her first fraud had a time limit on it. That was the fact that she was waiting for her 25th birthday. The car crash fraud didn't work because she got found out in the end and she got captured.
Yeah.
But her final con was the fact that following her release from prison, Violet disappeared. And nobody has ever been able to conclusively find out what happened to her.
Yeah.
Now, so it's almost, that was her most successful fraud. And that's what makes her so fascinating, is she managed to escape again. and nobody really knows what happened to Violet. Now, I actually managed to trace some ancestors of Violet's mum. I'm the only one who's ever been able to find any descendant of Violet's family, and I contacted them, very excited, thinking perhaps they'll be able to tell me something that's been kept secret for years. And it actually turned out that I knew more about Violet's whereabouts than they did. Really? So that's really how clever Violet was. So the way I approached it in the book is I have considered 4 or 5 different options.
Yeah.
They're almost a discussion really to try and come up with an answer to what happened to Violet. So there are 4 or 5 options in the book, and that's what I discuss in the final chapter of the book, the things that could have happened to Violet, and I'm trying to provide some evidence to back those theories up. So I think anybody who reads the book will enjoy guessing what happened to Violet and seeing if they agree or disagree with me, or maybe picking their favorite option.
I am now obsessed with the thought of what happened to her. It's a lot of it's about class, isn't it? I mean, this is the thought that was coming to me in my mind. That it's, you have people from relatively modest. I mean, she wasn't this is from the kind of like the kind of the lowest unskilled working class. Her dad was an engineer, but he was from that kind of artisan working class. But her and her mother were desperately acquiring the trappings of status, weren't they?
They were, yeah. And Violet, I remember I mentioned earlier that Violet had more success at persuading men than women to lend her money. Now, interestingly enough, she attended a very prestigious Highland ball in Inverness not long before she staged her disappearance. And this was really her last final go, really her last effort to try and find somebody else from which to borrow money. And there were several very wealthy high society ladies at this ball who saw right through Violet straight away. Now, they weren't taken in by her pretensions.
No.
They weren't taken in by her expensive clothes.
No.
One of the ladies said, somebody said, no real lady talks about her money. And Violet got, she wasn't quite able to con everybody, but
this interestingly is the thing,
enough, the class thing.
This is the thing in Britain about old money, and like old money in Britain is a very, very complicated world to navigate and understand. And old money isn't showy. There's an old history professor of mine who living in the middle of London. He said, well, you can spot people with old money because their barber jackets are all tatty and they drive kind of slightly battered Volvos. They're not vulgar or ostentatious with it at all. And I suppose that's how you hang on to it, really.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think Violet was maybe just a little bit too showy, particularly for the older ladies, because you had it's a really interesting period, the Edwardian period. It's probably my favorite period. I've written quite a few stories about the Edwardian era, and you had the older generation, very much Victorian ladies, far more starched, far stricter, and then you had the newer generation under the new king, who were more flamboyant. Clothes became a bit more relaxed. Art and culture was encouraged a bit more experimentation in art and music and things like that. So it really was a changing era. And Violet was a young girl in that era, and the elder generation certainly probably didn't like her, didn't take to her. She didn't have the right voice. Although she wasn't particularly well educated. Her mum used to keep her home from school quite a lot when she was young, claiming that Violet was ill. But Violet did read a lot. She was a voracious reader, and it seems that she was very good at holding conversations. She could certainly hold her own in a conversation and was probably interesting and engaging enough to talk to.
Yeah, in the way that a sort of like a socialite, would have been.
Yeah. So there was something else I did in the book towards the end of the book. I wanted the reader to hear Violet's voice rather than it being me telling Violet's story. I wanted them to actually hear how Violet spoke, or what the words that Violet used and what she would say.
Yeah.
So at the end of the book, I've put a lot of letters in, begging letters of Violet's that she wrote to her stockbrokers, pleading for more time to pay back money or to borrow more money, and some articles that she wrote for newspapers, and even a really awful melodramatic kind of mini novella that Violet wrote. I put those in the book so people can actually hear her voice, and they can actually listen to Violet's words and think to themselves, well, would I be taken in by her? Would I be seduced by her? So I thought I really wanted to get Violet's voice into the book as well. So I think that's an interesting part of the story as well.
Fantastic. So we must draw to a close in a moment, but let's give the book a plug. Currently available or waiting?
It's currently available, yeah. So the book is called Nothing for Something, the Violet Charlesworth story.
Okay.
And the phrase "nothing for something" comes from an old sort of a motto of a Chicago con artist. If you read the book, you'll find where it comes. You'll find out where it comes from. But book's called Nothing for Something. It's published by Whittles Publishing, and it is available now. Yeah.
Okay, and so as we say at the end of every interview we do, if you please can purchase the book from an independent book retailer, or if you can't, go straight to the publisher and purchase it from the publisher. I'll put the links in the chat below. If we can avoid buying from large online retailers that don't need any more money and support the little guys, then that's the right thing to do. Okay.
Perfect. Well said.
So, Mark, it's been a pleasure, and I'm always up for a story about a con artist. So please, if there are further stories that are in the pipeline about this sort of thing, please do return, because it'd be wonderful to talk further about it. And the very, very best of luck. It sounds like a kind of an extraordinary snapshot of an era, and I do think it's fascinating that you wove the suffrage story in there as well.
It's worth reading just for that alone. That is a really, really interesting part of the story. And we've run out of time. I didn't even have time to mention the mystery of Violet's diamond, so people will have to read the book to find that bit out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark, and thanks for today. And we'll catch you and everybody else will catch you soon on the podcast. All the best.
Thank you. Bye bye. Thanks.